This is the real meat and potatoes of this particular lesson. So pay attention in this and you should be ready to rock and roll. Okay, we're going to dive in here. We want to identify the number of zeros algebraically. We're going to use nothing but our number crunching abilities to find the number of possible zeros. Now, we are going to look at the quadratic formula, but we're not, for those of you who are dreading this, I promise, we're not going to use the whole darn thing. We're going to focus on just what's inside here, the b squared minus 4ac. Now, before we dive into that, I want to review really quickly. Make sure you know how to solve using the quadratic formula. So we're going to do this. If you want to try it without my help, hit pause, give it a shot. You know your a value is -2. You know your b value in this particular problem is 6. And you know your c value is 5. All right, -2x squared plus 6x plus 5. Now, at the beginning of this particular lesson, we already graphed this. This was number 1. You remember doing this on the front page. We put this in our TI Inspire already. We already know that it has 2 intercepts. It has 2 zeros. Now let's find those exact values using the quadratic formula. So again, opposite of b, plus or minus, square root of b squared. Okay, I like to put them all in parentheses. -4 times a, which we said was -2, times c, which was 5, all divided by 2 times a, which would be in parentheses because it's a negative. Now you go about simplifying this. Opposite of b still, plus or minus, now inside there, square root. 6 squared is 36. -4 times -2 is +8, times 5 would be +40, all divided by 2 times -2, which is -4. Again, we can simplify what's inside the square root, and we get -6 plus or minus the square root of 76 over -4. Now, I'm not going to lie. If I ask you for exact answers, the only thing I wouldn't like about this is the fact that it has a negative in the denominator. If we were to multiply top and bottom by a -1, we could keep ourselves an equivalent ratio, so it'd be the same solution, but eliminate that negative in the denominator. So if we multiply top and bottom by -1, all right, what we end up with is 6 plus or minus the square root of 76, all divided by 4. And that would be what I would want to have if I asked for exact answers. If you were asked to give decimal approximations, the decimal approximations, if you add, forgive me, you would find that if you add those two together, you get -0.6794. And if you subtract, you get +3.6794. So again, those would be the decimal approximations, one of those being an approximation while the other being the exact. All right, now that we've practiced using the quadratic formula, let's dive into what we're doing here. All right, we just talked about this. These numbered problems match up with exactly with the 6 graphs that we already did. So what we can do is go back to your first page and look at the very first page of your notes and look at 1, 2, and 3. How many numbers of zeros do we know they have? 1, 2, and 3 had 2, 0, and 1 zeros. We already did these problems. We already know the answer. The question is, can we then, I want to compare that with the value of what we call the discriminant, all right? The discriminant. That's the b squared minus 4ac. So we are going to find the value of b squared minus 4ac for these particular 3 problems. So here we go. B squared would be 6 squared minus 4 times -2 times 5. Didn't we already just do this one? Ended up being 36 plus 40, so we got 76 over here. Now let's move on to number 2. B squared would be -4 quantity squared, right? That's where that's coming from. Minus 4 times a, which was 1, right? That's in front of there, times 5. What do we end up with there? 16 minus 20. 16 minus 20. We get -4. And then move into the number 3 here. B squared would be 12 squared minus 4 times a, which was 2, times c, which is 18. Now, this takes a little work, but you end up with 144 minus 144, and we get 0. So what do we notice here? When our discriminant is positive, when we had 76, we had 2 real zeros. When it's negative, we have none, right? So when this was positive, we had 2 real zeros. When our discriminant value was negative, we had none. And when our discriminant was equivalent to 0, we had 1. Let's see if that holds true by looking at the other 3 that we graphed. This would be at the top of page 2. We already figured out these when we put them into our TI Inspire. And we found out that number 4 had 1 real 0. The number 5 here had 2 real zeros. And number 6 had 0. So what can we predict? What we think is going to happen here? In order to have 1 real 0, right? In order to have 1 real 0 for number 4, our discriminant, we're going to guess here, has to be equal to 0. Let's see if it works out. In order for number 5 to have 2 real zeros, then our discriminant has to be bigger than 0. That's what we're guessing. And for us to have 0, none, not at all, no real zeros, it would have to be less than 0 or negative. So let's find out. Let's calculate those actual discriminant values. So 8 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 16. So let's do the math here. That's 64. Negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4 times negative. That'd be 64 minus 64. Guess what? It is equal to 0. Then we have b squared. So it would be negative 4 quantity squared minus 4 times a times c. So let's do the math here. That'd be 16 minus or plus, ends up being 16 plus 10, which is 26. Guess what? That is greater than 0, just like we said it would be. And finally, b squared, 5 squared minus 4 times negative 3 times negative 4 ends up being 25. And then negative 4 times negative 3 is 12, but times negative 4 is negative 48. And 25 minus 48 is negative 23. Guess what? It ended up being negative. So it holds true. So when you write this in your notes, please write this in your notes. Okay? When we have the quadratic formula we're dealing with, and I'm going to write this over here. We have this opposite of b plus or minus, and I'm going to put the square root right here and the 2a. So I don't know why I wrote the 4 down there. When I have the 2a, this b squared minus 4ac is of critical importance. If, put this in your notes, this is big, write it down. If the discriminant b squared minus 4ac, if that is, if it is greater than 0, then you have 2 zeros, 2 real zeros. If, again, big deal, this is huge. If it's equal to 0, then you're only going to have 1 0. And finally, if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, then we will have 0 zeros. We have none at all, no real zeros at all. And if you can add that into your notes, that is huge. That concludes video number 2. Prep yourself for video number 3. It's gonna be a nail biter.